In this lesson, we cover image-based lighting and Arnold Sky. Basically, you are using an HDRI or high dynamic range image to illuminate your scene. This method provides the most realistic lighting and it's widely used in rendering. We have the same scene as our previous lesson. Let's just run the IPR. The first thing we need to do is to create an Arnold Sky. By default, you have this white environment because the color mode is set to constant and you only can define a color to be used as your environment. You can use a simple color if it works for you, or maybe you just want a simple color to fill in the dark parts of your render. Now, in order to use an image to illuminate your environment, you need to click on this small triangle besides color and change the value type from constant to texture or shader network. Let me change it to texture. We discussed the shader network mode later on in this lesson. Now you can define your HDR image. Let's define this sunset HDR image, which can be found in the Canon browser. There are tons of free HDR images in Cinema 4D's Canon browser that you can simply just open up your Canon browser and search for HDRI and you will find tons of them. And you can simply drag and drop those images into these texture slots of the Arnold Sky. Now, as you can see, we have loaded this image and our scene is being illuminated using this texture. Now, we have this beautiful realistic lighting that would be impossible without image-based lighting and the texture that we have loaded. Let me just rotate my Arnold Sky until I like what I see. Okay, that's nice. Obviously, you can control the intensity and exposure of the Arnold Sky and this HDR image using the intensity and exposure parameters like other lights. So when you increase the intensity, you get a brighter image, and as you decrease the image and illumination becomes darker. And as I reduce the intensity to something maybe like 0.1, because we are using a high dynamic range image, the sun is still bright and punchy, and that is why you can use this method to simulate different times of day using one HDR image. Then we have resolution, which we discussed, and you should set the resolution close to the actual resolution of the image, especially if you are having tons of reflective materials in your scene and you are able to actually see the HDR image in the reflections of those. So in that case, setting the resolution here as high as possible it would really help to have more basically sharper and more realistic reflections. And the HDR I'm using is about 4000 pixel wide, so we can type in 4000, but for faster renders, let me leave it at 1000. Also, we don't have any reflective material in the scene, so probably 1000 would be enough. The next option is the format of your HDR image. The image I loaded is a latitude longitude image, so the width is twice as long as the height. If your image is in another format like mirror ball or angular, you need to change the format right here. Using the camera contribution option, you can hide the HDR image from the camera, and this way we only see the illumination caused by this image and not the image itself, which can also be very, very useful. As always, you can clean your render by increasing the light sample. So let me increase the samples maybe to about 4. Now, let's get back to the main tab and clear this texture and change the value type to shader network. And now we can actually define a shader network to be used here as our HDRI background. Let me just go to the material manager, create menu, Arnold, texture, and create an image. And double click on the image and let's load our sunset HDR image. And now let's select our Arnold Sky and drag this shader to the color field. Now if we run the IPR again, we have the exact same result, but now we can do much more. For example, I can color correct this HDR image to my liking in the network editor. Let's open up the network editor for this image node and press Ctrl Tab and search for color correct node. And you can simply use your keyboard arrows to basically move between the search result when you press Ctrl Tab and search for something. So let's using the down key come to the color correct and press Enter to add it to the work area, and connect the output of the image node to the input of the color correct node and connect the color correct node to the Arnold Beauty port. At the time being, the shortcut to actually connect a node to the Arnold Beauty port is Alt W and V. I'm kind of trying to avoid using the shortcuts because the developers of Arnold for Cinema 4D tend to change shortcuts very quickly, and I'm afraid if I kind of tell you guys to use a shortcut, they change it in another release, and that would be problematic if you are trying to learn. Now, make sure IPR is running, and also to make sure we have quicker renders. Let me just reduce the light samples to 1, and in the render setting, decrease the diffuse samples to about 2. Now I can decrease the gamma in my color correct node to something like 0.6 and produce more contrast and sharper shadows if I wanted to, and maybe change the hue or reduce the overall saturation of the image. So as you can see, the shader network mode is preferable type compared to the texture mode. Now we can do a lot more here. Let me search for array switch node, for example, and add array switch RGBA. Make sure you're using the array switch RGBA because the other array switch is for basically working with shaders, and this is for working with images and textures, basically RGBA inputs. Now connected to the Arnold Beauty, we discuss array switch nodes and other nodes in the shading section of this course. For the moment, let's click on this blue input and load all the ports and inputs like camera, shadow, diffuse, reflection, diffuse transmission, specular reflection, and specular transmission. And connect the image node that contains the Sunset HDRI to all the ports. Now, if you take a look at the IPR, we have this render, but I can control drag this image node to make a duplicate. Let's load another HDRI image and connect it to the camera input of the array switch node. Now, even though we are using the Sunset HDRI to provide the illumination, the camera sees the second HDRI that we just loaded, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. You can do a lot using the shader network editor. We discuss it in the next section in detail. So in this lesson, we discussed Arnold Sky and image-based lighting. See you in the next lesson to discuss interior lighting using Arnold Sky. So see you there.